It is November 4th, 2017. I'm here in unincorporated Coweta County with former Republican Party of Georgia Chairman Mr. John M. Stuckey. My name is Ashton Ellett. This is another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Stuckey, taking time out of your Saturday morning.
You're welcome.
Just to begin with, I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about your childhood, your upbringing, things of that nature.
Well, I'm originally from Louisiana. I grew up in and around and about my grandfather's cotton farm, about as far back in the woods as you can get. So it was a rural upbringing in rural Louisiana. Attended public schools, went to LSU, undergraduate and graduate school, and George Washington University Law School.
So you told me you took an interest in history, and this is a totally self-serving question, but why were you interested in history, and how did it inform your later career in politics?
Well, I guess my father's sisters were all school teachers, and they were interested in the history of, I guess, not only Louisiana, but the South. And I just sort of absorbed that. Then when I got to LSU, T. Harry Williams, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Huey Long, was the head of the history department there, became my favorite professor. So that was sort of got me hooked. He was doing the oral history work on the biography of Huey Long then, and I got to tag along and carry probably the most primitive first ever version of a tape recorder.
Now, there's a gap in your schooling, 63 to 69. Is that when you were serving in the military?
Yes.
Tell me about your military experience.
Well, I was, of course, commissioned out of ROTC at LSU, as were all male students back in those days. I went to Infantry Officers Basic Training and Ranger School at Fort Benning. Mm-hmm. Then was assigned to the new Army Experimental Division at that time, the 11th Air Assault. And not having an overwhelming love of riding on helicopters, when the colonel told me that anyone with an advanced degree could apply for a branch transfer to the newly created intelligence branch, which was co-equal with the infantry and the artillery and the armor. Mm-hmm. I applied, received a branch transfer, was reassigned to the office of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence at the Pentagon.
What sort of, I don't know if this is classified or not, but what did your job in the intelligence branch entail back in the 60s? Mostly,
it was a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week office, as I'm sure you can guess.
Yeah.
And being a junior officer, I was first lieutenant then. I got to work every night and every holiday.
Got a good shift, huh?
Great shift work. But mainly it was monitoring what would now be considered crude communications from all across the world, and putting together what amounted to a briefing for the JCS on a daily basis on basically the situation. We had country teams mm-hmm. for different parts of the world. So we would get together about daylight and come up with a daily briefing for the JCS on a worldwide basis, and then sometimes take it over to the White House to the Situation Room.
Wow. That's some consequential work. I guess that'd be signals intelligence or communications.
Well, we didn't actually participate in any of the technical side of it. Okay. We just sat there and saw what came over in the way of cables, mm-hmm. primarily. Again, when you consider the degree of technology or the advanced state of technology today,
oh, sure,
it's almost equivalent to smoke signals.
But putting your practical experience as a historian and a researcher, applying it in a real-time setting, I suppose.
Yes, it was mostly deciding, when you read what came out of, say, Vietnam, mm-hmm. Who should know about that? Army, Navy, Air Force, White House, CIA, everybody, all the different agencies had their own intelligence gathering, and they shared between each other. So my job was basically to field the communications as they came in, to do a first level analysis of what it involved, who should know about it, and how it should be communicated to them.
Interesting. So just a hard pivot back to politics. You said you came out of Louisiana. Did you come from a political family?
No, not necessarily. I guess my first experience with politics was with T. Harry's programs on Huey Long. I just sort of became fascinated with Huey Long.
Fascinating. What was your assessment? I mean, because we talked before the camera was rolling about the outsized influence of not just Huey Long, but of Russell Long, the Long family in Louisiana politics. What was your assessment of him, his life, and his effects on state and Southern politics?
Well, I think somebody asked him one time, Huey I'm referring to now, not Russell, how he would explain himself, and he said, well, he couldn't. He was sui generis. He was nothing like him ever before, and I think that's true. He was not out of the same mold as the other Southern dynasties, the Byrds, the in Virginia, the
Talmadges here.
Talmadges here. He was sort of a precursor of Donald Trump.
in that populist style? Or?
Populist style, he stepped over the traces in every, conceivable way. He was not a traditional politician by any means, but as Williams points out in his biography, he was effective. He did things like dramatically expand the state university, the physical plant. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but when Long came into office, there were, maybe 1,500 miles of paved road in Louisiana. And when he left, there were, 10 times that much. People could, I can remember myself as a kid marveling at the farm to market program, which I think was a federal program.
The old farm to market roads.
Yeah.
Right.
But before that, the roads that came closest to my grandfather's farm was a road that was paved by Huey Long's administration.
So you grew up in Louisiana, a state dominated by Democratic politics, Democratic machines. Tell me about your
conversion.
Your conversion, your path to Republican politics.
Well, I think the when I got out of the Army and enrolled in George Washington University's night law school, I had to find a job during the daytime, and my wife at that was employed at the Republican National Committee, and I went over to see her a couple of times and decided that I would like to try to get a job there, and I tried and I did. So from there, then I met Bill Timmons, who we discussed earlier.
Right.
And then Timmons was sort of my mentor and in my conversion process. Then I went to work for Bill Brock in the House. So
what was your role or your position in the RNC before going out to work for Brock?
Primarily research and writing of, for instance, I worked for a long time on a paper, the origins of the involvement in Vietnam, which was the cardinal issue at that time.
Sure.
And, how it got started, how possibly to get out of it, using my military background.
Right.
I had more than a passing familiarity with
I'm sure.
the thing.
What was it like trying to transition into a campaign environment with Bill Brock's at that time congressional campaigns?
I liked it. I think if you read any biographical material on him, Brock was a great guy, but much like Paul Coverdell, he was not a hail fellow well met. He was, not a natural-born campaigner in the mold of say Bill Clinton.
Right.
Who, so it was sort of my job to trail along with him on the campaign trail and do the talking and smiling and shaking hands and prompting him to say what we had planned for him to cover at the particular meeting. Not that he did not have, the ability to do that, but it was easier once you kept moving. I mean, again, it gets back to the primitive nature of campaigning then. There was no internet, no extensive television coverage. So it was pretty much coffee clatches at different supporters' houses. And the 3rd District of Tennessee at that particular time was still pretty rural. You had Chattanooga and then the mountains.
Up to Chattanooga. Did it go all the way up to Knoxville and Kingsport?
Went all the way up to just below Knoxville, just to the south and east of Knoxville.
I guess that would have been more Howard Baker territory than okay.
Yeah, on up to the north and west was Howard Baker's territory.
Right. So somebody described Paul Coverdell. They said, rather than being a campaigner or a politician, he was a political operative at heart, less so than a politician. Would that be true of Bill Brock as well?
Yes.
That he was more into the nuts and bolts of how politics
More into the
worked.
nuts and bolts. Brock had a bit more of the personal touch than Coverdell. Mm-hmm. But you're right, both of them were nuts and bolts, cerebral politicians as opposed to emotional politicians.
Right. So you worked the 66 and 68 campaign. 68 was Brock won in 68.
Yes.
Were you also involved in the Senate campaign, 1970? Yes. Tell me about the difference in campaigning for the House in 1968 and the Senate in 1970.
Long drives.
It's a long drive from Knoxville to Memphis.
Long way from Knoxville to Memphis. We the East Tennessee, Upper East Tennessee, of course, was the only Republican part of the state,
right,
from the days of Reconstruction on down. So we set up a campaign headquarters in Nashville. The state back then was what they call Grand Divisions, the East Grand Division, the Middle Grand Division, and the West Grand Division. They were actually political subdivisions at the state level. So we parked in the Middle Grand Division at Nashville and ran the campaign out of there. And were primarily commuters between Nashville, and Memphis.
What lessons did you take away from that campaign that served you well later on in your career?
Not to listen to people who told you didn't have a chance. For instance, we were told that while Brock might do well in East Tennessee, in the area of the 3rd District, no Republican could scratch Al Gore Sr. in Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that that wasn't true. I also learned that it pays to organize. We had a Brock chairman in every county in Tennessee, which was difficult to do in terms of recruiting, and sometimes these people were effective and sometimes they weren't, but at least it was something that no one else had done up until that point in time that I'm aware of.
Why do you think Brock was successful in 1970?
Well, I think it was 68 Nixon, mm-hmm. the comeback from oblivion and the loss in California, that type of thing. And while people debate on whether Nixon actually had a Southern strategy or not, I think he obviously did, at least to the point that, most people want to make it a racial thing, but it wasn't a racial thing. It was the willingness of Nixon to come to the South and campaign for Republican candidates. He came and campaigned for Brock.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, he brought a lot of young Republicans into office. And that began to change the looks of things, moving away from the old dynasties. And, all of a sudden people who might be good prospective candidates thought, well, it's not a suicide mission. I could probably get elected if I just tried hard and had the right planning and financing.
So after the campaign, you go back to Washington.
Very briefly.
Okay. Tell me about your post-1970 career.
Well, I went back to Washington and decided that I probably, since I had put in quite a bit of time in the night division, getting a law degree, that I probably should try to practice law, get out of politics. And so for a couple of years there, I actually participated as a partner in a law firm in Washington, a small three-man firm with a guy named Ben Cotton and a guy who later became governor of Tennessee, Jim Day.
Yeah.
So we had a small law firm there, and then I did quite a lot of work for the Brock Candy Company and Brock Interests, and which meant that I was coming to Chattanooga or Atlanta a lot. And then with the onset of the Watergate mess, I decided that it'd be better if I just got the hell out of Washington and came to Atlanta. I thought about going back to Louisiana, but Louisiana had a completely different legal system.
Oh, correct. Napoleonic. The Code Napoleon.
Code Napoleon. So I would have had to have jumped through a lot of hoops to get licensed to practice there.
Right.
And, Louisiana was not particularly prosperous at that point in time. Nothing was in Louisiana was happening akin to what was happening in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw Atlanta as a major upside, plus I had the Brock business, and I just brought it down here and set up.
Okay. At what point did you go back to the RNC with Bill Brock once he was chairman?
I went back with him as special counsel to the chairman.
Right. So his lawyer.
His lawyer.
So what did you do in that role, and what did you see Brock's role as RNC chairman? What did he bring to the party?
Well, he brought the same abilities that he had as a congressman. He was recognized as a bright guy, somebody who knew the ABCs of the political process, who was generally perceived to be a moderate, who was acceptable to across the spectrum of the Republican politics, who had been around, one as a Republican in the Tennessee in a district that had never been hadn't been represented by a Republican since the Civil War or Reconstruction. So he had a good record. He had made a lot of friends in the Senate, and he was a good friend of Reagan.
Right.
So I think that's what he was pretty well liked. It was a little bit of what I call the Johnny Isakson effect. Isakson is the only politician that I know, and I love Johnny. Everybody loves Johnny. You know anybody that doesn't like Johnny?
Nobody that comes readily
except
to
maybe
mind.
Nancy Pelosi.
Maybe.
Or Schumer.
Maybe.
But
they probably like Johnny if you asked them.
But Brock was a little bit like Isakson. He did not have rough edges, and people. He was moderate philosophically, and people liked him, and he knew what he was doing.
How did you eventually get involved in the Georgia Republican Party?
Well, when I got down to Atlanta, I was here for about 6 months, and I decided that I definitely did not want to live in town. I was interested in horses, so I started looking for a property that was outside the city, but yes, close enough that I could commute to a downtown office. And I came to Coweta County and bought this place and moved in on Pearl Harbor Day in 1970. And since my wife is from Roanoke, Virginia, it was renamed Roanoke Farm.
Well, that answered that question.
And then we started raising horses and kids.
Which one's harder?
John Moore, the son. Oh, between kids and horses.
Yes.
Horses.
Well, that's good. I'm sure your son will be glad to hear that one.
Yes. Well, he never quite took an interest in horses. His sister is one of the best horsewomen in the country today. She's
wow.
Coaches North Carolina State's equestrian team.
No kidding.
And also runs or helps run one of the biggest equestrian centers in North Carolina, Portofino, just outside of Raleigh. She received the U.S. Cavalry Award and all sorts of things. Was a junior Olympian.
This is totally unrelated, but my wife's alma mater, William Woods University out in Missouri, has a really big equestrian program, hunter jumper program, Western dressage, things of that nature. So you moved out here. This would have been the old 6th district at the time. 1970 would have been Jack Flint would have been the congressman out here.
Yep.
What was your assessment of the political state of Georgia? You know, of the party
Well, the party
system?
was virtually non-existent. You know, you had Signs of Life with Bo Calloway and Mac Mattingly and people like that, but you know, they were just beginning to bud. And so given my background, and people knew that I had been in Republican politics, people asked me why I didn't get off my duff and do something. So I did, and eventually became 3rd District Chairman, and then ran for state chairman. I helped Newt in his first campaign.
So this would be 1974?
That's when he lost. Mm-hmm. Then he won in 76. I believe that's right.
No, 76 would have been Carter, the Carter campaign.
Well,
it would have been 78.
78.
After Flint retired. Yeah. I'm not sure. Virginia Shepard.
Being 78 years old makes it hard to remember that it was 78. Yeah, it was 78. Yeah, he ran twice.
Right.
He kept coming back. I owned some property up by the Atlanta airport at that particular point in time, and we made that Newt's campaign headquarters.
What was your? Tell me about a young Newt Gingrich. What was your assessment of him?
About everyone else's assessment of him. Extremely bright guy. Again, not warm and cuddly. I keep comparing people to Johnny Isaacson, and I certainly don't mean to compare Isaacson to Bill Clinton, but I mean who didn't have the touch, mm-hmm. the political touch. You know, you could parachute Bill Clinton into Cambodia, and he would grin and grip his way out. But Newt was not universally loved by the rank and file, but he was persistent.
Sure.
And he worked hard and worked through 2 losses until he finally won. And then went on from there to do what I considered to be very great work in the House.
So you eventually became one of the leaders here in the congressional district, the district party.
I was chairman of the district party.
Right. You were instrumental in recruiting a young Republican, Skin Edge, to to
I
run
did.
for state senate.
I was, I can't remember if I was district chairman or county chairman at that point in time, but I knew Skin through the local law practice and thought that he was, a star, potential star, up-and-comer. And I remember the day I actually went down to his office and convinced him to run, and that if he would run, I would chair his campaign and help him with his fundraising. And he bought in, and we won.
I'm going to pause it for a second. So tell me how you go from, what were the challenges and the difficulties of being a county chairman and a district chairman over here in West Georgia?
Well, this was actually one of the principal outposts of the party as it existed then. You had Coverdell and Fred Cooper and Johnny, not just primarily Coverdell and Fred Cooper in Atlanta. And one of the charges they always made against you or against me was, well, you're just another buckhead Republican. I said, no, I'm not. As a matter of fact, I live in Coweta County. But this was, I think, the first place we made a significant degree of progress with Newt. And then, of course, there was Mattingly, which I guess was the first statewide success. Bo was a success, but then we got ambushed on that one.
The laws were such that it kept Bo Calloway out of the governor's mansion in '66.
Yes, I wonder what CNN would say about that now in terms of, the popular vote.
Different times, different context.
Very definitely. I was greatly saddened by Bo's passing. He was a great friend of mine.
And an important figure in building the party with GOPAC, with Newt and Pete DuPont.
Yeah.
I guess another figure from your district, Randy Evans, who's now National Committee man.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, Ambassador to Luxembourg now.
Well, Randy was one of those guys, like a little bit like Newt, that had a resume 5 pages long and just kept plugging. You have to remember, I remember being in court in Fulton County one day, and I don't know how it came up, but the judge, and an aside, not as part of the proceedings, said, "You're a Republican, son. Why do you want to waste your time doing that?" But Randy, a little bit like Newt, kept his head down and kept trying. Was a bright guy, and
so you became state party chairman in 1987, succeeding somebody we've mentioned before, Paul Coverdell.
Yes.
Did you volunteer to run? Were you dragooned into it by other Republicans?
I was sort of talked into it by Coverdell.
Okay.
We had become good friends over the years. Coverdell's chief aide was a guy named John Teasley. Anybody ever mention him to you? Mm-hmm. Tragically died very young.
Yeah.
But Teasley was, having spent time in Washington, spent time on campaigns, I valued very highly dedicated, talented staffers. And Teasley was 100% in both those categories. And so it was Teasley who sort of involved me with Coverdell to begin with. And then once I got to know Paul and Fred Cooper, it was not a very big group back in those days. So, if you had a rapport with those people, you did. And we all tried to recruit other people to get involved in the party, to expand it, because it was not something that promised unbridled success.
Just to interrupt you, were you one of what Paul Coverdell always called his point men? Were you one of his point people out here in the district or in the county?
I don't know if I was a point person. I don't personally recall that,
Okay.
that description, but yes, I worked with Paul every opportunity I had, and when he was state chairman, and tried to do my best to expand the operation.
Right. So tell me about the convention process. Back then, it's basically campaigning for office to be state party chairman. What was that process like, convincing people that you were the man for this particular job at that particular time?
Things that would seem roughly equivalent to Cro-Magnon communications now, like direct mail,
Yeah.
phone banks. That was pretty much it, and missionary visits. So when I decided to run, Bob Bell was the favorite, and so it was a matter of doing pretty much what we did in the '70 Senate campaign in Tennessee, and that's get on the road and go from one place to another. If you get somebody to have a reception for you or a coffee for you, you want to do that. And the party was pretty small, pretty hardcore, so you weren't attending large rallies.
Right. So what was the state of the party infrastructure, the party apparatus, fundraising, recruiting, research? What was the state of it that you found when you became chairman?
Well, Coverdell had made, and Jay Morgan had made considerable progress with not much in the way of financing and a lot of ground to cover. But it certainly did not approach the state of operational capabilities that you see now. Primarily because, outside of Metro Atlanta, outside of what's now the 5th and 3rd districts, really, and then maybe a little down in Savannah, young guys like Jack Kingston and people like that. I was, I think, the first chairman to try to hold campaign candidate recruitment and instruction seminars across the state. Again, which we had done in the 1970 campaign in Tennessee, and that's try to get interested and capable people together and try to tell them what they could do to assist the candidate or to assist the party or to advance the party's interest.
This was a period where the computer program Orvis, so-called, where you would use computers and algebraic models to target specific races.
Maybe somebody else did.
Maybe that's a question for Cliff Lorick or the executive director.
Yeah, very definitely.
Okay, so moving into so you were elected state party chairman in 87. 88 was a presidential election year.
Yes.
Reagan, term limited. George H.W. Bush, the favorite. What was the level of coordination between you and the state party and the Bush organization here in Georgia? Because Bush organization, Fred Cooper was Bush's state party chair. Paul Coverdell was Southern coordinator. Jay Morgan was on that team.
Yeah. I tried to stay. Remember, Dole was in for a while.
That's right. And Jack Kim.
And Jack was in for a while. I tried to stay as neutral as I could because when I worked for Brock in the House, Dole was on the same floor of the old Longworth House office building. And because of his military record and because he's an extremely bright and friendly guy,
right,
I got to know Dole, the way a staffer would get to know a member of Congress. we weren't buddies, but I greatly admired him, and I didn't want to, be partisan in one way or the other. So I tried to be. One of the things that sort of was the flashpoint for what later became an extremely unpleasant encounter with the Robertson campaign was I had a meeting at my office with, I think, Cooper for the Bush camp. Jack Kemp's man was Rusty Paul. I'm not sure Dole had anybody on the ground then.
Nobody comes to mind. I can look it up later.
But anyway, and our ever-loving, again, a senior moment here for Pat Robertson.
Brant Frost
the fourth. There had been at the district conventions and some of the county conventions some of the things that Antifa does today, people shouting from the audience and rushing the podium and things like that. My position was then, look, we're in the embryonic stage of birthing the party or bringing the party to maturity in the state of Georgia. We don't need that kind of thing. I mean, there are no burning issues out there unless you want to talk about abortion or whatever.
Which was the Robertson campaign.
Yeah, the Robertson campaign.
Energize.
And so, what I asked everybody to do was to tune it down. And of course, that didn't happen, as you know, from the horror stories of the Albany in '88.
Tell me about, because there were accusations leveled at, after the convention, because George H.W. Bush, let's be clear, won the Super Tuesday primary handily in Georgia.
Yes.
There were accusations that you and the state party worked very closely with the Bush campaign in an effort to preclude the Robertson people from participating and going on as convention delegates to New Orleans.
That's not true. As I just related to you, I made an effort to calm the waters by asking them, don't rock the boat. We're trying to, expand the party. You don't have to take over the district conventions and turn over the podium in order to make your points. No, we did not coordinate with the Bush campaign to the exclusion of the Robertson campaign. Now, I actively undertook to exclude the crazies from the state convention, which I'm sure you're aware of.
You already mentioned the convention center down in Albany, Georgia, which I'll admit, the Republicans have not been back to Albany, Georgia since 1988.
Well, I tell you how we got there. The old accusation kept bubbling up. Well, this is a buckhead Republican Party, a silk stocking country club Republican Party.
Sure.
So I told Teasley, look, find some place in South Georgia, a small town. Let's have the state convention there. And in order to try to demonstrate that, we do things outside of Atlanta and Savannah. And that's how we ended up in Albany.
Not only did you end up there, as you mentioned, basically two rival slates of delegates, alternates, supporters, hangers-on, about twice the number of people you probably expected to be there, or maybe more. What was the process of trying to sort out, because it was a process running sort of concurrently in the courts, and then the party had folks trying to determine credentials?
Well, it was the same thing that had occurred starting at the county level to the district level on up, and that is acrimony when they could not. When I say they, I mean primarily the Robertson faction. When they didn't have the votes to elect a regular slate of delegates, they went off and elected a rump delegation. And that's essentially what flowed into the state convention. My experience with Brant Frost and the other Robertson people, I decided that we would look at the delegates that were certified by the county party, the district parties, and they would be the people that we would seat. If you weren't on that list, you didn't come in.
Mm-hmm.
Strangely enough, one of the things we've laughed about over the years, and that is that Ralph Hudgens and his wife Suzanne, who are great friends of mine now, were some of the people that we kept out. Ralph was out in the parking lot, and wait a minute, I know Stuckey, he ought to let me in. And then, of course, we had the pandemonium that broke loose and the incident with the gavel.
We'll talk about the gavel in a second. What precipitated your dismissing the convention, to close the convention early? What was the lead up to that?
Well, it was not something that was planned.
Sure.
It was something that I decided on horseback at the podium. I don't know that there are any films or videos surviving from that.
Unfortunately, I don't think so. Maybe the Albany News down there.
Well, I'd be interested in seeing them if you come across them. But let me explain to you that it was pandemonium. I mean, they started the same tactics that they pulled at the district and county levels, and that is what I call the Antifa approach. That's screaming and hollering and
rabble rousing.
To the point where, we had, I think when Coverdale came out to speak, they drowned him out. I love Paul, but he looked like he just shown up at Pearl Harbor on December 7th.
Sort of shell-shocked by the reception.
And it became so contentious that you couldn't conduct the business. So I simply adjourned the convention, sine die. That's after the gavel accidentally slipped out of my hand.
So for the record, slipped out of your hand. You didn't hit it so hard it broke.
I did not hit it so hard it broke. No, it slipped out of my hand.
So the convention is adjourned. The regulars, as they were called, the Republican regulars, depart. The Robertson folks, that rump group that you said, stayed. Were the mayor of Albany, who was a Democrat, what was his role in? I believe he gave them the convention space to conduct their business.
I don't know, because as you point out, the regulars, I certainly, with my staff and people, departed. And one of the funny vignettes, we had anticipated that there would be that kind of commotion. So Teasley had arranged for, I think it was Albany State University football team to serve as security for the party, and they were down at the bottom of the podium. And when the righteous crowd started toward the podium, they stood up and suddenly dampened their enthusiasm for rushing the podium, which was one of the few thrilling and pleasing moments of the old show. No, after that, the regulars and the state party staff departed. And I don't know what happened after that. I didn't pay any attention to it because there was nothing you could do. It was sort of like, and every once in a while when I hear about Ryan trying to deal with the Freedom Caucus.
Paul Ryan, Speaker Ryan,
trying to deal with the Freedom Caucus. I remember how easy it was to deal with the Robertson crowd. And to me, there's a little bit of that mentality there.
Sure. It's as you said, you departed, and then reconvened the state central committee or the executive
state central committee,
and that was per party rules that you were able to fill the slate, the at large.
Oh yes.
So Tell me about the process of you filled the slates and you're ready to go to New Orleans. Did you know you were going to have a credentials fight on your hands?
Yes.
How did you prepare for that?
Well, I went to Washington and talked to the chairman of the RNC.
Who was that at the time? Of course, I asked that question. It's been 88. So.
Senior moment. I'll think of it in a minute.
Is it Dick Richards?
Yes.
Okay. It was either Dick Richards or Fahrenkopf. It might have been Dick Richards from Utah.
It was Richards. And, to dispel any rumors of coordination between my group, the regulars in Georgia, and the Bush campaign didn't do a lot to help us with the national party, the RNC, because, their position was, we don't want to, kick that sleeping dog, or it wasn't sleeping, but it was growling. So I didn't get a lot of support from the Bush group.
Is that because they viewed it as they wanted to focus on moving on with the general election campaign, and that was just a Georgia issue?
It was a side issue and something that they could not, there was no mileage, no upside in it for them getting involved, unless they did it out of fidelity to the state party and the leadership of the state party and the regulars here. And again, it's proof positive of the fact that we didn't collude with the Bush campaign going in.
A timely term.
In timely terms. There was no feeling on their part that they owed the state party or they owed me anything. So consequently, we went to New Orleans, still exposed to the same hysteria that we were exposed to in Albany.
Even though, as you say, there was no active collusion with the Bush camp, did you still expect your slate to be seated by the Credentials Committee, by the RNC?
Yes.
What was your reaction, your fellow regular Republicans' reaction when you were dealt a setback by the party?
Well, I think I was totally disheartened, disillusioned, and to use the Latin phrase, pissed off.
That's high Latin.
Yes. To the point that I thought I would resign.
Right, because you could have sought a second 2-year term at that point.
Yes.
Marguerite Williams was the National Committee woman.
The Grande Dame.
She had some of the more colorful responses. Tell me about Marguerite Williams. Tell me about what role she played in the party at that time.
Well, as I said, the Grande Dame. Marguerite was a well-to-do contributor and personally extremely nice lady. We weren't that blessed with well-to-do contributors and extremely nice ladies, so she occupied a sort of a saint in the party. I loved her. Coverdale loved her. Cooper loved her.
Fred Cooper was a neighbor, a childhood friend.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think Marguerite felt the same way that a lot of us felt, and that was that, we had come out and spent a lot of time and effort to, in effect, try to bring the party into, I guess you would call it adolescence in Georgia, not maturity. And here these people came out of the woods in a not very diplomatic way, and certainly not willing to sit down and say, hey, let's talk about this. So everybody was, to a certain extent, not only disillusioned, but embittered.
And Marguerite Williams was one of those embittered.
Yes, she was. And that was probably one of the more tragic results of the whole thing, because she should not have been disappointed. I mean, she had gone to great lengths. She was there for the party when there were not a lot of people there for the party.
When you said the Robertson folks, or the so-called what would become known as either the Christian right, the religious right, when you said they came out of the woods, where were they politically before 1988?
I don't know. You know, that's an interesting question. As a matter of fact, I think we were all surprised that that they were so antagonistic from the start. Thinking back on it, I don't remember anything that, you know, the establishment, you know, the Coverdells, the Coopers, the Stuckeys,
Sure,
did to antagonize that group. And as I said, I made an effort to bring them all in. All the chairs of the presidential campaigns in Georgia: Cooper for Bush, Rusty Paul for Jack Kemp.
and Frost.
Yeah. Bring them in, talk to them, and say, "Hey, look, we don't have that much goodwill. I mean, we don't have that much in the bank to spend on this. We're trying to build a party here. What are we arguing about? What is it that you don't like?" And then once you got past the abortion issue, there wasn't, you know. And by the way, nobody on the regular side of the equation was pro-abortion.
It was just a matter of prioritizing or
Yeah, you know, given all of the other issues at the time, it seemed to me that spending an undue amount of time discussing that or emphasizing that as an issue was counterproductive. You know, again, as I said, most of the people in the regulars, had you have asked, you know, are you pro or anti-abortion, you would have said, well, I'm anti-abortion.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Certainly I would have. But that never occurred. That discussion never occurred. All of a sudden, they were just there, intent on in a rather boisterous, antagonistic manner, taking control of the party.
Did you, from the moment you declined to run for re-election, did you realize that fight from 1988 was going to spill over into the 89 party chair election as well?
Oh yeah, I didn't think they were going to go away.
So were you active in helping elect Ellett Poitevin to succeed you?
No, I was not. I didn't think Ellett needed my help, and I had by that time become the great Satan. And so I didn't think I could do him any good. You know, Ellett was one of those guys who had worked in the vineyards, you know, put his shoulder to the wheel of every buggy we tried to pull for years, and was a regular in every respect. He had Coverdell's support, he had Cooper's support, and I didn't figure that since I was, you know, the lightning rod, you know, at that point in time, and I think probably now I tend to be a little colorful in language. I think I said, I've forgotten how I phrase it, these are the people that brought you the burning of Joan of Arc. Is that still around?
I would have to, I'll put it this way, if that's a quote, it probably found its way into a newspaper somewhere.
I can't remember what else I said, but anyway, the burning of Joan of Arc, I forgot what, anyway, I despised them as much as they despised me, and I think I don't know how your interview with Cooper went, but I think Cooper despised them too. Did he not?
Well, he was very diplomatic, very very politic in his reminiscing.
Well, perhaps I should be, but I can't work my way around to that point.
Looking ahead, you know, you You said that you weren't necessarily active in party affairs as much as you had been when you were county chair, district chair, state chair. But the Christian right, as you mentioned, didn't go away. How was the Republican Party of Georgia able to incorporate those Christian conservatives into the party, and what role did it help or did it play in growing a majority party?
Well, I think the development or the change in the South began in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Nixon was a big part of that. And the 68 campaign demonstrated that the National Republican Party cared about the South and thought it was worth, rolling the dice to try to expand the party down here. Then the other thing that I thought about was that the economic prosperity of the South began to come out of maybe starting back with Huey Long paving the roads, and Huey Long certainly wasn't a Republican. But with the economic viability of the South increasing, and a lot of young people, guys like me with a law degree and looking to make it, showed up, and the old order was not exactly welcoming, and the old order was primarily Democrats. You look at this county, the county commission was 100% Democrat, all the county government, now it's 100% Republican.
Mm-hmm.
It happened that the young people who showed up, got a job, bought a house, had kids, had nothing in common with the old order.
Being as you mentioned, the courthouse gang.
The courthouse gang.
Courthouse crowd.
And, it had, and I know that I probably should be more diplomatic in this in terms of the party, but it had less to do with ideology and philosophy, political philosophy, than it did with just, the fact that the old crowd had nothing in common with the newcomers and offered them no welcoming hand or seemed to be interested in any of the things that we were interested in.
What role did you were part and parcel of building an actual modern Republican Party apparatus with recruiting, fundraising, research, public relations? Did the Democratic Party of Georgia have anything like that?
No.
Or did they just rely on political inertia and some barbecues here and there?
They relied on the total absence of the opposition. No Republican Party. No. They relied upon the old clans. Again we talked about the Russells, the Byrds.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't, as I think I mentioned earlier, I was the first Republican chairman to actually try to organize seminars to recruit candidates and educate candidates on how to run for office and what they needed to do in terms of mechanics of fundraising. Of course, the mechanics weren't that sophisticated then. We get back to direct mail and telephone
that was
banks.
Cutting edge for the time.
Cutting edge. Well, for instance, when Edge ran,
mm-hmm.
when I managed Edge's campaign, one of the old buildings on the square in Noonan, what used to be the old, the old hardware store there. I can't remember the name of the family that ran the hardware. Was they had given up the ghost on the hardware store. But it was right on the corner, the southwest corner of the square. We put in a telephone bank there, and we got the Republican women. The Republican women were a very important organization. We got people to come in there and do telephone banks. It was the first time anybody had ever done that I was aware of, certainly in this area, and maybe anywhere in the state. We did direct mail, and telephone banks, and trail riding.
Well, I mean, and not to downplay it, but Skin had his opposition was no slouch. It was Arthur Bolton, the former Attorney General for that race. Was that 1980, 86, 84? So why do you think it is that Georgia Democrats were able to hold on to power for so long in the state?
The inertia of the opposition. We just talked about the effort that it took to organize and modernize the Republican Party in Georgia. It was not an easy thing to do, and it was not particularly rewarding. I could have been much more profitable to me to stay at the office and practice law than to drive to Albany for the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Well, I guess that begs the question why you chose to do it and why people like you chose to do that sort of work in the 80s.
Well, I think that people recognize a need to modernize the process, to correct the mistakes, oversight, and abuses of the old order. If your brother-in-law or your father-in-law was a county commissioner, you got the road paved or something, that type of thing, as opposed to a modernistic approach. I wouldn't even want to call it modernistic, a reasonable approach to doing this, as opposed to the old ways and scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. I think that's what prompted a lot of people to get into it. Edge was, I actually had great hopes for Edge being ultimately the governor. A perfect candidate, well-spoken, handsome guy. Once you started, people like that weren't invited into the old order.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, somebody who had been the chairman of the county commission for 20 years was not looking for somebody, a bright young guy to bring on board or a bright young woman to bring on board.
Why do you think it was that Democratic Party of Georgia relied on primarily the votes of African Americans and rural whites, what a political scientist called the night and day coalition? You had one of the most liberal, progressive constituencies in African Americans, and then one of the most conservative constituencies in rural whites. How do you think? Why was the Democratic Party of Georgia able to fuse those core constituencies together for so long?
If I knew that, I could win the Pulitzer Prize with before you made it with your history. I'm not so sure that the Democrat Party is still that strong with rural whites.
Oh, absolutely not today, for sure.
Not today. But they, again, when we talked about the new young people coming into areas where all of a sudden there were jobs and money, like Coweta County or Atlanta, or Coweta County is the satellite of Atlanta, Savannah, the Jack Kingstons in Savannah. That kind of progress and the upside opportunity and promise of a better future did not pervade into the rural areas,
mm-hmm.
the backcountry.
Okay.
So I think it took a while to trickle down.
Looking at the Republican Party of Georgia today, we've gone from it being a relatively insignificant minority party to the governing party, holding wide majorities in both houses of the General Assembly, every statewide elected office, the governor's mansion since 2002. What do you think the biggest risk to the Republican Party in maintaining its majority is? What could possibly come along to enable a comeback by Georgia Democrats?
I don't think the Georgia Democrats or national Democrats have a prospect of coming back. I think they trade in identity politics. I think they have the same problem now nationally that they had at the county level, and that is they've grown old and set in their ways, and their ways are not something that appeals to the populace. I don't think, I can't name a Democrat who is not a minority, going back to the black base of the party. I can't name anybody other than Kasim Reed who would be a viable prospect for a Democrat governor of Georgia. Can you?
Well, there are a pair of Democrats. One, Stacey Abrams, who is she's an African American woman, but Stacey Evans is also a state representative from Smyrna. She has the backing of Roy Barnes, Buddy Darden, some of the older elements of the Democratic Party. But now, whether that gets to your issue of viability.
Well, I know Stacey Abrams. She's a bright woman.
The former minority leader in the House.
Yeah. She certainly has the brains and the experience to do it, but I don't think, electing a black governor in the way of Kasim Reed would not be the same thing as electing a black woman.
How do you mean?
Well, I think the argument that somehow a woman, whether she's black, white, yellow, or whatever color, suddenly deserves prime consideration, died with Hillary's. So I think now a candidate, whether she's black or white, a woman is going to have to go out and earn her spurs in the same way that a male candidate would go out and earn their spurs. In other words, there's no more celestial blessing there.
In 2016, since you brought up Hillary Clinton, if you looked at Donald Trump, his career, his persona, coming into the Republican Party dominated by heavyweights like Jeb Bush was in the campaign, Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, even a Ted Cruz. How was Donald Trump able to win the nomination of a party that for a very long time had been pro-free trade, pro-immigration to a degree, and win the party nomination on a platform of economic nationalism, economic protectionism?
Well, the times they are changing. And I've seen Trump compared to Andrew Jackson in a number of cases. Somebody who broke the mold, and to tell the truth and brutally stating the caliber of his opposition in the Republican primary was not that much. There was nobody there, of the same stripe of a Reagan or even, by the way, a Nixon. Mm-hmm.
And there were many of them that could
and there were
split
many
the
of them,
vote,
a whole
sure.
herd,
It was 18, 19,
16. 16, I think.
At that point, who's counting?
Yeah, that's right. But Trump came in and broke the mold, and I would imagine that there were a lot of, no, I don't imagine, I know that there were a lot of voters, not in the Republican primaries, but in the general election, who came over from the Democrat side, the blue-collar side. Essentially, Hillary, again, as I think I mentioned earlier, I view Hillary as some sort of malignant growth on the body politic of the country, who poisons everything she comes in touch with. But I think people were just Republicans and Blue Dog Democrats were just tired of the same old crap. Now, I did not run out and enthusiastically vote for Trump. I have to admit that I'm becoming more of a Trump supporter every day that goes by. I don't know whether that's because of the validity of Trump's programs, his efforts in this regard, or it's revulsion at the Democrat opposition, the resistance. But I've forgotten where somebody said this the other day, where Trump's reaction to the strike in New York on the bike path was, well, the son of a bitch was an animal, we ought to execute him. Oh, well, you can't. You have to be more diplomatic, more legalistic about that. We should talk about due process. Well, stop somebody on the road out here and ask them what their due process view of handling an ISIS fighter is.
So you're saying the President Trump has a connection, or is able to connect at a very basic level with the average voter, the man on the street.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about that. Now, guys like Stuckey and Cooper, and have been around long enough that they're going to sort of shiver at the tweeting. But the Jacksonian approach, I'm sure Monroe and Jefferson and crowd felt the same way.
John Quincy Adams certainly.
John Quincy Adams felt the same way about Jackson that most people feel about Trump. There's a realism out there in Trump's approach to things that a lot of people, national politicians don't have. Being an old Army guy, I see that sometimes a refined approach to the enemy is not necessarily the most promising approach if you're reaching out to win. So arguing about whether this guy should be tried in New York under federal law, or you can't try him in New York under state law because they don't have the death penalty, but or maybe no penalty at all. I don't know New York law, but there's a degree of frustrated realism that Trump appeals to.
I was talking to somebody the other day. We were mentioning free trade, globalization versus economic populism, economic nationalism. Is there any way to reconcile those two positions from, say a Wall Street corporate business chamber of commerce style republicanism to a more Trump style republicanism, or is that just something that one side is going to win out over the other?
I think that I sincerely hope that there's a way to reconcile the two. I think that every once in a while when Lindsey Graham says something that can be interpreted as mildly pro-Trump, it's an indication that things are beginning to thaw there. The Flakes and the Corkers and the McCains, McCain deserves a lot of respect for his service record and that type of thing, but he was a terrible presidential candidate. And, I think he's too old and crotchety. I can say that because I'm in that category for a leadership position in the Senate now. But you can see the guys like Graham coming around. On the other side of the aisle, you can see the guys like Manchin, who promise that perhaps if the economic nationalism of Trump was just a little more diplomatically stated and pushed, that you could begin to thaw out the bipartisan or the partisan walls and barriers there, which, but economic nationalism, I think, is going to be the predominant influence for quite some time now.
Well, I think I was talking to Congressman Barr about this. It's not just an American phenomenon. If you look at Great Britain with Brexit or France with the election with Macron and Le Pen, that for a very long time, voters, electorates were promised something from globalization or free trade that didn't necessarily deliver for a wide swath of people. Do you think that that's in both parties, with Bernie Sanders, for example, is much more economically nationalistic?
I think that's the trend that's going to continue and blossom, and I hope comes to an accommodation with the Chamber of Commerce approach. Here's the thing, with the Chamber of Commerce approach, or the other side of the aisle, is the holier than thou syndrome. Well, you know, the deplorables. If you people only understood, if you were smart enough to understand how the cow eats the cabbage, you would do what we tell you to do. Now that gets back to, you know, the natural revulsion on the part of your average plumber to put up with that kind of crap. You know, don't talk down to me. You know, we gives you the inalienable right to call in and run things from Brussels or Washington, because you haven't been an unqualified success. And you nowhere have you been an unqualified success. As a matter of fact, you've been mostly an unqualified disaster. So let's, you know, all those things in economic nationalism make sense on a common sense slate. Mm-hmm. I mean, for instance, I had never heard of the immigration lottery. Had you?
I would be lying if I said yes. I learned about it following the recent news.
You know, somewhere there's a happy middle ground between the way FDR handled the Japanese in the internment camps in the 1940s and the way we have to deal with the immigration problem now. And that is, if somebody shows up and starts, you know, preaching radical Islam at a mosque, you need to know about it. You need to do something about it before they run over some poor kid riding a bicycle in New York. You can't float off into the ether and start coming up with all these, you know, equal protection for all and ethereal.
Well, I suppose that's why we have the courts, which moves as, you know, you are a lawyer. The legal process moves a lot slower than the political process, and maybe that's something too, you know, well, the current atmosphere.
The legal process probably needs to be sped up a little bit. You know, for instance, things that totally make no goddamn sense at all. Mirandizing an ISIS fighter and treating them within the confines of the legal system. Now, I haven't taken the time to look at this, but these people are enemy fighters. They should be treated that way in a special category. By that, I don't mean shipped off to Guantanamo, but I mean we need to get off our ass and come up with a new system to handle that. Now, we don't necessarily need to communicate that or promote that in tweets, but we need to talk about it, and we need to not be so sanctimonious or scholastic in our approach.
We've been talking the last few minutes about sort of national level politics. Do you think the same dialogues, the same conflicts are playing out at the state level in places like Georgia? Or is it different?
Not to the same degree. When you get down to the state level, you begin to deal with the realities of economic development. Whether or not this intersection has a two-way stop sign, that type of thing. So you're dealing with the more realities, both in terms of what happens on the ground and both in terms of what's affordable on the ground. So you're closer to the situation, closer to the road in Georgia than you are in Washington. So you have the same kind of racial or identity politics budding at the state level, and I hate to see that happen. Things that frankly scare the hell out of me are, the white privilege, Antifa on one side and the KKK on the other side. I think the KKK is a bugaboo that's not there anymore. That's just used for, what the hell was the last time somebody showed up, I don't know, other than Charlottesville?
Charlottesville, and there was a recent one outside Murfreesboro, Shelbyville, Tennessee. But those marchers were vastly outnumbered by counter protesters.
Yeah, if you had somebody to be afraid of or frightened of, would it be the KKK or Antifa? Regardless of your political philosophy, if you thought, here's some crazy son of a bitch that may kill me.
Well, that's why I'm the interviewer. I'm the one that asks the questions.
Yeah, it may blow up my grandson's school or, shoot it up. That gets back to, and again, remember, this is me responding after a very bad experience with the religious right. But I'm very uncomfortable with anybody who has divine approval for what they do, so that they don't have to listen to the everyday concerns of the average schlock. In other words, I'm bulletproof here. Allah Akbar, or
Do you think we mentioned the Chamber of Commerce or sort of the business Republicans, business conservatives? Do you think that they still hold sway over the state party? That economic development is priority number one above all else?
No, the Chamber of Commerce didn't hold sway over the state party when I was state chairman. They were certainly an important part of potential constituency, but I think that the guy or girl who finish high school, go to college, get a job, buy a house, raise kids, those are the people you ought to be concerned about, and I hope that that's the Republican constituency that's identified and courted and developed. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that happened when we were building the party in the 70s and 80s, that those were the people that came on board, not someone who has a divine mission or some idea that they've been mistreated, that their great-grandfather was a slave, or their great-grandfather, or your great-grandfather was a slave owner, where that type of ethereal, conspiratorial thinking gets off into mass shootings.
Do you think demographic change, the growth of metropolitan Atlanta, the growth in numbers of Hispanic Georgians, Asian Americans living in and around Atlanta, do you think that has the possibility to sort of reshape the politics of Georgia, of a state like Georgia?
If the Democrats don't run completely off the rails, which they have a prospect of doing now, that situation is much worse than it is on the other side of the aisle, but it's reflected more and less in the press. If they don't if identity politics and racial politics does not blow up in their face, and I think this Donna Brazile expose of the fact that Hillary derail Bernie, and she derailed him, not for any political motive that bears serious consideration, but just to be in charge of the operation. I think that, a Hispanic or a black or anybody else who has a job and buys a house and tries to raise a family is going to be attuned to the same hopes, fears, and aspirations as the Republican Party. It's just a matter of expressing those and communicating them to those people. I mentioned my representing pro bono, by the way, wounded veterans. The last time I was in court, or next to the last time I was in court in Coweta County, I was representing a guy here on a green card who has a family, bought a house, has a lawn maintenance business, and was stopped by highway patrol with an invalid driver's license. Now, he should have had a valid driver's license, but
sure.
I don't think that your average Republican is prejudiced in that regard and thinks that that a Hispanic or a black can't become a Republican. And to the degree that that's communicated and that line of thinking is expanded and refined, no, I don't think that a massive demographic shift will make that much difference if we pay attention.
Anything else you'd like to get down into posterity before we call it a day?
Well, I certainly hope that LSU beats Alabama tonight. And I think, get back to the divinely inspired quest. Somewhere along the line, Alabama has to be dethroned, and I'm sure God's behind that movement.
I'm sure everybody, every University of Georgia fan agrees with you and wishes LSU the best of luck today.
I don't know if LSU can do it, but I have great hopes that Georgia can do it.
Well, from your lips to God's ear. Thank you very much, Mr. Stuckey, for participating.
You're welcome.
The Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.